the supramental manifestation upon earth. I take the opportunity of the publication of this issue of the Bulletin d'Education Physique of the Ashram to give my blessings to the journal and the association JSASA, Jeunesse Sportive de l'Ashram de Sri Aurobindo. In doing so, I would like to dwell for a while on the deeper raison d'etre of such associations and especially the need and utility for the nation of a widespread organization of them and such sports or physical exercises as are practiced here. In their more superficial aspect, they appear merely as games and amusements which people take up for entertainment or as a field for the outlet of the body's energy and natural instinctive activity or for a means of the development and maintenance of the health and strength of the body. But they are or can be much more than that. They are also fields for the development of habits, capacities and qualities which are greatly needed and of the utmost service to a people in war or in peace, and in its political and social activities, in most indeed of the provinces of a combined human endeavor. It is to this which we may call the national aspect of the subject that I would wish to give especial prominence. In our own time these sports, games and athletics have assumed a place and command a general interest such as was seen only in earlier times in countries like Greece, where all sides of human activity were equally developed and the gymnasium, chariot racing and other sports and athletics had the same importance on the physical side as on the mental side the arts and poetry and the drama, and were especially stimulated and attended to by the civic authorities of the city-state. It was Greece that made an institution of the Olympiad, and the recent re-establishment of the Olympiad as an international institution is a significant sign of the revival of the ancient spirit. This kind of interest has spread to a certain extent to our own country, and India has begun to take a place in international contests such as the Olympiad. The newly founded state in liberated India is also beginning to be interested in developing all sides of the life of the nation and is likely to take an active part and a habit of direction in fields which were formerly left to private initiative. It is taking up, for instance, the question of the foundation and preservation of health and physical fitness in the nation and in the spreading of a general recognition of its importance. It is in this connection that the encouragement of sports and associations for athletics and all activities of this kind would be an incalculable assistance. A generalization of the habit of taking part in such exercises in childhood and youth and early manhood would help greatly towards the creation of physically fit and energetic people. But of a higher import than the foundation, however necessary, of health, strength and fitness of the body is the development of discipline and morale and sound and strong character towards which these activities can help. There are many sports which are of the utmost value towards this end, because they help to form and even necessitate the qualities of courage, hardihood, energetic action and initiative or call for skill, steadiness of will or rapid decision and action, the perception of what is to be done in an emergency and dexterity in doing it. One development of the utmost value is the awakening of the essential instinctive body consciousness which can see and do what is necessary without any indication from mental thought and which is equivalent in the body to swift insight in the mind and spontaneous and rapid decision in the will. One may add the formation of a capacity for harmonious and right movements of the body, especially in a combined action, economic of physical effort and discouraging waste of energy, which result from such exercises as marches or drill and which displace the loose and straggling, the inharmonious or disorderly or wasteful movements common to the untrained individual body. Another invaluable result of these activities is the growth of what has been called the sporting spirit. That includes good humor and tolerance and consideration for all, a right attitude and friendliness to competitors and rivals, self-control and scrupulous observance of the laws of the game, fair play and avoidance of the use of foul means, an equal acceptance of victory or defeat without bad humor, resentment or ill will towards successful competitors, loyal acceptance of the decisions of the appointed judge, umpire or referee. These qualities have their value for life in general and not only for sport, but the help that sport can give to their development is direct and invaluable. If they could be made more common not only in the life of the individual but in the national life and in the international where at the present day the opposite tendencies have become too rampant, existence in this troubled world of ours would be smoother and might open to a greater chance of concord and amity of which it stands very much in need. More important still is the custom of discipline, obedience, order, habit of teamwork, which certain games necessitate. For without them success is uncertain or impossible. Innumerable are the activities in life, especially in national life, in which leadership and obedience to leadership in combined action are necessary for success, victory in combat or fulfillment of a purpose. The role of the leader, the captain, the power and skill of his leadership, his ability to command the confidence and ready obedience of his followers is of the utmost importance in all kinds of combined action or enterprise, but few can develop these things without having learnt themselves to obey and to act as one mind or as one body with others. This strictness of training, this habit of discipline and obedience is not inconsistent with individual freedom. It is often the necessary condition for its right use, just as order is not inconsistent with liberty but rather the condition for the right use of liberty and even for its preservation and survival. In all kinds of concerted action this rule is indispensable. Orchestration becomes necessary and there could be no success for an orchestra in which individual musicians played according to their own fancy and refused to follow the indications of the conductor. In spiritual things also the same rule holds. A sadhak who disregarded the guidance of the guru and preferred the untrained inspirations of the novice could hardly escape the stumbles or even the disasters which so often lie thick around the path to spiritual realization. I need not enumerate the other benefits which can be drawn from the training that sport can give or dwell on their use in the national life. What I have said is sufficient. At any rate, in schools like ours and in universities sports have now a recognized and indispensable place, for even a highest and completest education of the mind is not enough without the education of the body. Where the qualities I have enumerated are absent or insufficiently present, a strong individual will or a national will may build them up, but the aid given by sports to their development is direct and in no way negligible. This would be a sufficient reason for the attention given to them in our ashram, though there are others which I need not mention here. I am concerned here with their importance and the necessity of the qualities they create or stimulate for our national life. The nation which possesses them in the highest degree is likely to be the strongest for victory, success and greatness, but also for the contribution it can make towards the bringing about of unity and a more harmonious world order towards which we look as our hope for humanity's future. Note: Bulletin d'Education Physique, Bulletin of Physical Education, started appearing from February 21, 1949, and this message was dictated by Sri Aurobindo for it on December 3, 1948. The title of this quarterly bilingual journal was altered in 1959 to Bulletin du Centre International d'Education Sri Aurobindo, Bulletin of Sri Aurobindo International Centre of Education, and it continues to appear under that title to this day. Perfection of the body. The perfection of the body, as great a perfection as we can bring about by the means at our disposal, must be the ultimate aim of physical culture. Perfection is the true aim of all culture, the spiritual and psychic, the mental, the vital, and it must be the aim of our physical culture also. If our seeking is for a total perfection of the being, the physical part of it cannot be left aside, for the body is the material basis, the body is the instrument which we have to use. Sariram Kalu Dharmasthanam, says the old Sanskrit adage, the body is the means of fulfillment of Dharma, and Dharma means every ideal which we can propose to ourselves and the law of its working out and its action. A total perfection is the ultimate aim which we set before us, for our ideal is the divine life which we wish to create here, the life of the spirit fulfilled on earth, life accomplishing its own spiritual transformation even here on earth in the conditions of the material universe. That cannot be unless the body too undergoes a transformation, unless its action and functioning attain to a supreme capacity and the perfection which is possible to it or which can be made possible. I have already indicated in a previous message a relative perfection of the physical consciousness in the body and of the mind, the life, the character which it houses as, no less than an awakening and development of the body's own native capacities, a desirable outcome of the exercises and practices of the physical culture to which we have commenced to give in this ashram a special attention and scope. A development of the physical consciousness must always be a considerable part of our aim, but for that the right development of the body itself is an essential element. Health, strength, fitness are the first needs, but the physical frame itself must be the best possible. A divine life in a material world implies necessarily a union of the two ends of existence, the spiritual summit and the material base. The soul with the basis of its life established in matter ascends to the heights of the spirit but does not cast away its base, it joins the heights and the depths together. The spirit descends into matter and the material world with all its lights and glories and powers, and with them fills and transforms life in the material world so that it becomes more and more divine. The transformation is not a change into something purely subtle and spiritual to which matter is in its nature repugnant and by which it is felt as an obstacle or as a shackle binding the spirit. It takes up matter as a form of the spirit, though now a form which conceals and turns it into a revealing instrument. It does not cast away the energies of matter, its capacities, its methods. It brings out their hidden possibilities, uplifts, sublimates, discloses their innate divinity. The divine life will reject nothing that is capable of divinization. All is to be seized, exalted, made utterly perfect. The mind, now still ignorant, though struggling towards knowledge, has to rise towards and into the supramental light and truth and bring it down so that it shall suffuse our thinking and perception and insight and all our means of knowing till they become radiant with the highest truth in their inmost and outermost movements. Our life, still full of obscurity and confusion and occupied with so many dull and lower aims, must feel all its urges and instincts exalted and irradiated and become a glorious counterpart of the supramental superlife above. The physical consciousness and physical being, the body itself must reach a perfection in all that it is and does which now we can hardly conceive. It may even in the end be suffused with a light and beauty and bliss from the beyond, and the life divine assume a body divine. But first the evolution of the nature must have reached a point at which it can meet the spirit direct, feel the aspiration towards the spiritual change and open itself to the workings of the power which shall transform it. A supreme perfection, a total perfection is possible only by a transformation of our lower or human nature, a transformation of the mind into a thing of light, our life into a thing of power, an instrument of right action, right use for all its forces, of a happy elevation of its being, lifting it beyond its present comparatively narrow potentiality for a self-fulfilling force of action and joy of life. There must be equally a transforming change of the body by a conversion of its action, its functioning, its capacities as an instrument beyond the limitations by which it is clogged and hampered even in its greatest present human attainment. In the totality of the change we have to achieve, human means and forces too have to be taken up, not dropped but used and magnified to their utmost possibility as part of the new life. Such a sublimation of our present human powers of mind and life into elements of a divine life on earth can be conceived without much difficulty. But in what figure shall we conceive the perfection of the body? In the past the body has been regarded by spiritual seekers rather as an obstacle, as something to be overcome and discarded than as an instrument of spiritual perfection and a field of the spiritual change. It has been condemned as a grossness of matter, as an insuperable impediment, and the limitations of the body as something unchangeable making transformation impossible. This is because the human body even at its best seems only to be driven by an energy of life which has its own limits and is debased in its smaller physical activities by much that is petty or coarse or evil. The body in itself is burdened with the inertia and inconscience of matter, only partly awake and, although quickened and animated by a nervous activity, subconscient in the fundamental action of its constituent cells and tissues and their secret workings. Even in its fullest strength and force and greatest glory of beauty, it is still a flower of the material inconscience. The inconscient is the soil from which it has grown and at every point opposes a narrow boundary to the extension of its powers and to any effort of radical self-exceeding. But if a divine life is possible on earth, then this self-exceeding must also be possible. In the pursuit of perfection we can start at either end of our range of being, and we have then to use, initially at least, the means and processes proper to our choice. In yoga the process is spiritual and psychic. Even its vital and physical processes are given a spiritual or psychic turn and raised to a higher motion than belongs properly to the ordinary life and matter. as for instance in the hatha-yogic and raja-yogic use of the breathing or the use of asana. Ordinarily, a previous preparation of the mind and life and body is necessary to make them fit for the reception of the spiritual energy and the organization of psychic forces and methods, but this too is given a special turn proper to the yoga. On the other hand, if we start in any field at the lower end, we have to employ the means and processes which life and matter offer to us and respect the conditions and what we may call the technique imposed by the vital and the material energy. We may extend the activity, the achievement, the perfection attained beyond the initial, even beyond the normal possibilities, but still we have to stand on the same base with which we started and within the boundaries it gives to us. It is not that the action from the two ends cannot meet and the higher take into itself and uplift the lower perfection, but this can usually be done only by a transition from the lower to a higher outlook, aspiration and motive. This we shall have to do if our aim is to transform the human into the divine life. But here there comes in the necessity of taking up the activities of human life and sublimating them by the power of the Spirit. Here the lower perfection will not disappear, it will remain but will be enlarged and transformed by the higher perfection which only the power of the Spirit can give. This will be evident if we consider poetry and art, philosophic thought, the perfection of the written word or the perfect organization of earthly life. These have to be taken up and the possibilities already achieved or whatever perfection has already been attained included in a new and greater perfection, but with the larger vision and inspiration of a spiritual consciousness and with new forms and powers. It must be the same with the perfection of the body. The taking up of life and matter into what is essentially a spiritual seeking, instead of the rejection and ultimate exclusion of them, which was the attitude of a spirituality that shunned or turned away from life in the world, involves certain developments which a spiritual institution of the older kind could regard as foreign to its purpose. A divine life in the world or an institution having that for its aim and purpose cannot be or cannot remain something outside or entirely shut away from the life of ordinary men in the world or unconcerned with the mundane existence. It has to do the work of the divine in the world and not a work outside or separate from it. The life of the ancient rishis in their ashramas had such a connection. They were creators, educators, guides of men, and the life of the Indian people in ancient times was largely developed and directed by their shaping influence. The life and activities involved in the new endeavor are not identical, but they too must be an action upon the world and a new creation in it. It must have contacts and connections with it and activities which take their place in the general life and whose initial or primary objects may not seem to differ from those of the same activities in the outside world. In our ashram here we have found it necessary to establish a school for the education of the children of the resident sadhaks, teaching upon familiar lines though with certain modifications, and taking as part and an important part of their development an intensive physical training which has given form to the sports and athletics practiced by the jeunesse sportive of the ashram and of which this bulletin is the expression. It has been questioned by some what place sports can have in an ashram created for spiritual seekers and what connection there can be between spirituality and sports. The first answer lies in what I have already written about the connections of an institution of this kind with the activities of the general life of men, and what I have indicated in the previous number as to the utility such a training can have for the life of a nation and its benefit for the international life. Another answer can occur to us if we look beyond first objects and turn to the aspiration for a total perfection, including the perfection of the body. In the admission of an activity such as sports and physical exercises into the life of the ashram, it is evident that the methods and the first objects to be attained must belong to what we have called the lower end of the being. Originally they have been introduced for the physical education and bodily development of the children of the ashram school, and these are too young for a strictly spiritual aim or practice to enter into their activities, and it is not certain that any great number of them will enter the spiritual life when they are of an age to choose what shall be the direction of their future. The object must be the training of the body and the development of certain parts of mind and character so far as this can be done by or in connection with this training, and I have already indicated in a previous number how and in what directions this can be done. It is a relative and human perfection that can be attained within these limits. Anything greater can be reached only by the intervention of higher powers, psychic powers, the power of the spirit. Yet what can be attained within the human boundaries can be something very considerable and sometimes immense. What we call genius is part of the development of the human range of being, and its achievements, especially in things of the mind and will, can carry us halfway to the divine. Even what the mind and will can do with the body in the field proper to the body and its life, in the way of physical achievement, bodily endurance, feats of prowess of all kind, a lasting activity refusing fatigue or collapse and continuing beyond what seems at first to be possible, courage and refusal to succumb under an endless and murderous physical suffering. These and other victories of many kinds, sometimes approaching or reaching the miraculous, are seen in the human field and must be reckoned as a part of our concept of a total perfection. The unflinching and persistent reply that can be made by the body as well as the mind of man and by his life energy to whatever call can be imposed on it in the most difficult and discouraging circumstances by the necessities of war and travel and adventure is of the same kind, and their endurance can reach astounding proportions, and even the inconscient in the body seems to be able to return a surprising response. The body, we have said, is a creation of the inconscient and itself inconscient or at least subconscient in parts of itself and much of its hidden action. But what we call the inconscient is an appearance, a dwelling place, an instrument of a secret consciousness or a superconscient which has created the miracle we call the universe. Matter is the field and the creation of the inconscient and the perfection of the operations of inconscient matter, their perfect adaptation of means to an aim and end. The wonders they perform and the marvels of beauty they create, testify, in spite of all the ignorant denial we can oppose, to the presence and power of consciousness of this superconscience in every part and movement of the material universe. It is there in the body, has made it, and its emergence in our consciousness is the secret aim of evolution and the key to the mystery of our existence. In the use of such activities as sports and physical exercises for the education of the individual in childhood and first youth, which should mean the bringing out of his actual and latent possibilities to their fullest development, the means and methods we must use are limited by the nature of the body, and its aim must be such relative human perfection of the body's powers and capacities and those of the powers of mind, will, character, action of which it is at once the residence and the instrument so far as these methods can help to develop them. I have written sufficiently about the mental and moral parts of perfection to which these pursuits can contribute, and this I need not repeat here. For the body itself, the perfections that can be developed by these means are those of its natural qualities and capacities and, secondly, the training of its general fitness, as an instrument for all the activities which may be demanded from it by the mind and the will, by the life energy or by the dynamic perceptions, impulses and instincts of our subtle physical being, which is an unrecognized but very important element and agent in our nature. Health and strength are the first conditions for the natural perfection of the body, not only muscular strength and the solid strength of the limbs and physical stamina, but the finer, alert and plastic and adaptable force which our nervous and subtle physical parts can put into the activities of the frame. There is also the still more dynamic force which a call upon the life energies can bring into the body and stir it to greater activities, even feats of the most extraordinary character of which in its normal state it would not be capable. There is also the strength which the mind and will by their demands and stimulus and by their secret powers which we use or by which we are used without knowing clearly the source of their action can impart to the body or impose upon it as masters and inspirers. Among the natural qualities and powers of the body which can be thus awakened, stimulated and trained to a normal activity, we must reckon dexterity and stability in all kinds of physical actions, such as swiftness in the race, dexterity in combat, skill and endurance of the mountaineer, the constant and often extraordinary response to all that can be demanded from the body of the soldier, sailor, traveler or explorer, to which I have already made reference, or in adventure of all kinds and all the wide range of physical attainment to which man has accustomed himself or to which he is exceptionally pushed by his own will or by the compulsion of circumstance. It is a general fitness of the body for all that can be asked from it which is the common formula of all this action, a fitness attained by a few or by many, that could be generalized by an extended and many-sided physical education and discipline. Some of these activities can be included under the name of sports. There are others for which sport and physical exercises can be an effective preparation. In some of them a training for common action, combined movement, discipline are needed, and for that our physical exercises can make one ready. In others a developed individual will, skill of mind and quick perception, forcefulness of life energy and subtle physical impulsion are more prominently needed and may even be the one sufficient trainer. All must be included in our conception of the natural powers of the body and its capacity and instrumental fitness in the service of the human mind and will, and therefore in our concept of the total perfection of the body. There are two conditions for this perfection: an awakening in as great an entirety as possible of the body consciousness and an education, an evocation of its potentialities, also as entire and fully developed and, it may be, as many-sided as possible. The form or body is, no doubt, in its origin a creation of the inconscient and limited by it on all sides, but still of the inconscient developing the secret consciousness concealed within it and growing in light of knowledge, power and ananda. We have to take it at the point it has reached in its human evolution in these things, make as full a use of them as may be and, as much as we can, further this evolution to as high a degree as is permitted by the force of the individual temperament and nature. In all forms in the world there is a force at work, unconsciously active or oppressed by inertia in its lower formulations, but in the human being conscious from the first, with its potentialities partly awake, partly asleep or latent. What is awake in it we have to make fully conscious, what is asleep we have to arouse and set to its work, what is latent we have to evoke and educate. Here there are two aspects of the body consciousness, one which seems to be a kind of automatism carrying on its work in the physical plane without any intervention of the mind and in parts even beyond any possibility of direct observation by the mind or, if conscious or observable, still proceeding or capable of continuing, when once started, by an apparently mechanical action not needing direction by the mind and continuing so long as the mind does not intervene. There are other movements taught and trained by the mind which can yet go on operating automatically but faultlessly even when not attended to by the thought or will. There are others which can operate in sleep and produce results of value to the waking intelligence. But more important is what may be described as a trained and developed automatism, a perfected skill and capacity of eye and the hands and all the members prompt to respond to any call made on them, a developed spontaneous operation as an instrument, a complete fitness for any demand that the mind and life energy can make upon it. This is ordinarily the best we can achieve at the lower end, when we start from that end and limit ourselves to the means and methods which are proper to it. For more we have to turn to the mind and life energy themselves or to the energy of the spirit and to what they can do for a greater perfection of the body. The most we can do in the physical field by physical means is necessarily insecure as well as bound by limits. Even what seems a perfect health and strength of the body is precarious and can be broken down at any moment by fluctuations from within or by a strong attack or shock from outside. Only by the breaking of our limitations can a higher and more enduring perfection come. One direction in which our consciousness must grow is an increasing hold from within or from above on the body and its powers and its more conscious response to the higher parts of our being. The mind preeminently is man, he is a mental being and his human perfection grows the more he fulfills the description of the Upanishad, a mental being, Purusha, leader of the life and the body. If the mind can take up and control the instincts and automatisms of the life energy and the subtle physical consciousness and the body, if it can enter into them, consciously use and, as we may say, fully mentalize their instinctive or spontaneous action, the perfection of these energies, their action too becomes more conscious and more aware of itself and more perfect. But it is necessary for the mind too to grow in perfection, and this it can do best when it depends less on the fallible intellect of physical mind, when it is not limited even by the more orderly and accurate working of the reason and can grow in intuition and acquire a wider, deeper and closer seeing and the more luminous drive of energy of a higher intuitive will. Even within the limits of its present evolution it is difficult to measure the degree to which the mind is able to extend its control or its use of the body's powers and capacities, and when the mind rises to higher powers still and pushes back its human boundaries, it becomes impossible to fix any limits, even, in certain realizations. An intervention by the will in the automatic working of the bodily organs seems to become possible. Wherever limitations recede and in proportion as they recede, the body becomes a more plastic and responsive and in that measure a more fit and perfect instrument of the action of the spirit. In all effective and expressive activities here in the material world, the cooperation of the two ends of our being is indispensable. If the body is unable, whether by fatigue or by natural incapacity or any other cause, to second the thought or will, or is in any way irresponsive or insufficiently responsive, to that extent the action fails or falls short or becomes in some degree unsatisfying or incomplete. In what seems to be an exploit of the spirit so purely mental as the outpouring of poetic inspiration, there must be a responsive vibration of the brain and its openness as a channel for the power of the thought and vision and the light of the word that is making or breaking its way through or seeking for its perfect expression. If the brain is fatigued or dulled by any clog, either the inspiration cannot come and nothing is written, or it fails and something inferior is all that can come out, or else a lower inspiration takes the place of the more luminous formulation that was striving to shape itself, or the brain finds it more easy to lend itself to a less radiant stimulus, or else it labors and constructs or responds to poetic artifice. Even in the most purely mental activities, the fitness, readiness or perfect training of the bodily instrument is a condition indispensable. That readiness, that response too, is part of the total perfection of the body. The essential purpose and sign of the growing evolution here is the emergence of consciousness in an apparently inconscient universe, the growth of the consciousness and with it growth of the light and power of the being, the development of the form and its functioning or its fitness to survive, although indispensable, is not the whole meaning or the central motive. The greater and greater awakening of consciousness and its climb to a higher and higher level and a wider extent of its vision and action is the condition of our progress towards that supreme and total perfection which is the aim of our existence. It is the condition also of the total perfection of the body. There are higher levels of the mind than any we now conceive, and to these we must one day reach and rise beyond them to the heights of a greater, a spiritual existence. As we rise, we have to open to them our lower members and fill these with those superior and supreme dynamisms of light and power. The body we have to make a more and even entirely conscious frame and instrument, a conscious sign and seal and power of the spirit. As it grows in this perfection, the force and extent of its dynamic action and its response and service to the spirit must increase. The control of the spirit over it also must grow, and the plasticity of its functioning both in its developed and acquired parts of power and in its automatic responses down to those that are now purely organic and seem to be the movements of a mechanic in conscience. This cannot happen without a veritable transformation, and a transformation of the mind and life and very body is indeed the change to which our evolution is secretly moving, and without this transformation the entire fullness of a divine life on earth cannot emerge. In this transformation the body itself can become an agent and a partner. It might indeed be possible for the spirit to achieve a considerable manifestation with only a passive and imperfectly conscious body as its last or bottommost means of material functioning, but this could not be anything perfect or complete. A fully conscious body might even discover and work out the right material method and process of a material transformation. For this, no doubt, the Spirit's supreme light and power and creative joy must have manifested on the summit of the individual consciousness and sent down their fiat into the body, but still the body may take in the working out its spontaneous part of self-discovery and achievement. It would be thus a participator and agent in its own transformation and the integral transformation of the whole being. This too would be a part and a sign and evidence of the total perfection of the body. If the emergence and growth of consciousness is the central motive of the evolution and the key to its secret purpose, then by the very nature of that evolution this growth must involve not only a wider and wider extent of its capacities but also an ascent to a higher and higher level till it reaches the highest possible. For it starts from a nethermost level of involution in the inconscience which we see at work in matter creating the material universe. It proceeds by an ignorance which is yet ever developing knowledge and reaching out to an ever greater light and ever greater organization and efficacy of the will and harmonization of all its own inherent and emerging powers. It must at last reach a point where it develops or acquires the complete fullness of its capacity, and that must be a state or action in which there is no longer an ignorance seeking for knowledge but knowledge self-possessed, inherent in the being, master of its own truths and working them out with a natural vision and force that is not afflicted by limitation or error. Or if there is a limitation, it must be a self-imposed veil behind which it would keep truth back for a manifestation in time but draw it out at will and without any need of search or acquisition in the order of a right perception of things or in the just succession of that which has to be manifested in obedience to the call of time. This would mean an entry or approach into what might be called a truth consciousness self-existent in which the being would be aware of its own realities and would have the inherent power to manifest them in a time creation in which all would be truth following out its own unerring steps and combining its own harmonies. Every thought and will and feeling and act would be spontaneously right, inspired or intuitive, moving by the light of truth and therefore perfect. All would express inherent realities of the spirit. Some fullness of the power of the spirit would be there. One would have overpassed the present limitations of mind would become a seeing of the light of truth, will of force and power of the truth, life a progressive fulfillment of the truth, the body itself a conscious vessel of the truth and part of the means of its self-effectuation and a form of its self-aware existence. It would be at least some initiation of this truth consciousness, some first figure and action of it that must be reached and enter into a first operation if there is to be a divine life or any full manifestation of a spiritualized consciousness in the world of matter. Or, at the very least, such a truth consciousness must be in communication with our own mind and life and body, descend into touch with it, control its seeing and action, impel its motives, take hold of its forces and shape their direction and purpose. All touched by it might not be able to embody it fully, but each would give some form to it according to his spiritual temperament, inner capacity, the line of his evolution in nature. He would reach securely the perfection of which he was immediately capable and he would be on the road to the full possession of the truth of the spirit and of the truth of nature. In the workings of such a truth consciousness there would be a certain conscious seeing and willing automatism of the steps of its truth which would replace the infallible automatism of the inconscient or seemingly inconscient force that has brought out of an apparent void the miracle of an ordered universe, and this could create a new order of the manifestation of the being in which a perfect perfection would become possible. Even a supreme and total perfection would appear in the vistas of an ultimate possibility. If we could draw down this power into the material world, our age-long dreams of human perfectibility, individual perfection, the perfectibility of the race, of society, inner mastery over self and a complete mastery, governance and utilization of the forces of nature could see at long last a prospect of total achievement. This complete human self-fulfillment might well pass beyond limitations and be transformed into the character of a divine life. Matter after taking into itself and manifesting the power of life and the light of mind would draw down into it the superior or supreme power and light of the spirit and in an earthly body shed its parts of inconscience and become a perfectly conscious frame of the spirit. A secure completeness and stability of the health and strength of its physical tenement could be maintained by the will and force of this inhabitant, all the natural capacities of the physical frame. All powers of the physical consciousness would reach their utmost extension and be there at command and sure of their flawless action. As an instrument the body would acquire a fullness of capacity, a totality of fitness for all uses which the inhabitant would demand of it far beyond anything now possible. Even it could become a revealing vessel of a supreme beauty and bliss, casting the beauty of the light of the spirit suffusing and radiating from it as a lamp reflects and diffuses the luminosity of its indwelling flame, carrying in itself the beatitude of the spirit, its joy of the seeing mind, its joy of life and spiritual happiness, the joy of matter released into a spiritual consciousness and thrilled with a constant ecstasy. This would be the total perfection of the spiritualized body. All this might not come all at once, though such a sudden illumination might be possible if a divine power and light and Ananda could take their stand on the summit of our being and send down their force into the mind and life and body, illumining and remolding the cells, awaking consciousness in all the frame. But the way would be open and the consummation of all that is possible in the individual could progressively take place. The physical also would have its share in that consummation of the whole. There would always remain vistas beyond as the infinite spirit took up towards higher heights and larger breadths the evolving nature, in the movement of the liberated being towards the possession of the supreme reality, the supreme existence, consciousness, beatitude. But of this it would be premature to speak. What has been written is perhaps as much as the human mind as it is now constituted can venture to look forward to and the enlightened thought understand in some measure. These consequences of the truth consciousness descending and laying its hold upon matter would be a sufficient justification of the evolutionary labor. In this upward all-uplifting sweep of the spirit there could be a simultaneous or consecutive downward sweep of the triumph of a spiritualized nature all-including, all-transmuting, and in it there could occur a glorifying change of matter and the physical consciousness and physical form and functioning of which we could speak as not only the total but the supreme perfection of the body. The divine body. A divine life in a divine body is the formula of the ideal that we envisage. But what will be the divine body? What will be the nature of this body, its structure, the principle of its activity, the perfection that distinguishes it from the limited and imperfect physicality within which we are now bound? What will be the conditions and operations of its life still physical in its base upon the earth by which it can be known as divine? If it is to be the product of an evolution, and it is so that we must envisage it, an evolution out of our human imperfection and ignorance into a greater truth of spirit and nature, by what process or stages can it grow into manifestation or rapidly arrive? The process of the evolution upon earth has been slow and tardy. What principle must intervene if there is to be a transformation, a progressive or sudden change? It is indeed as a result of our evolution that we arrive at the possibility of this transformation. As nature has evolved beyond matter and manifested life, beyond life and manifested mind, so she must evolve beyond mind and manifest a consciousness and power of our existence free from the imperfection and limitation of our mental existence, a supramental or truth consciousness and able to develop the power and perfection of the spirit. Here a slow and tardy change need no longer be the law or manner of our evolution. It will be only so to a greater or less extent so long as a mental ignorance clings and hampers our ascent. But once we have grown into the truth consciousness, its power of spiritual truth of being will determine all. Into that truth we shall be freed and it will transform mind and life and body. Light and bliss and beauty and a perfection of the spontaneous right action of all the being are there as native powers of the supramental truth consciousness, and these will in their very nature transform mind and life and body even here upon earth into a manifestation of the truth conscious spirit. The obscurations of earth will not prevail against the supramental truth consciousness, for even into the earth it can bring enough of the omniscient light and omnipotent force of the spirit to conquer. All may not open to the fullness of its light and power, but whatever does open must to that extent undergo the change. That will be the principle of transformation. It might be that a psychological change, a mastery of the nature by the soul, a transformation of the mind into a principle of light, of the life force into power and purity would be the first approach, the first attempt to solve the problem, to escape beyond the merely human formula and establish something that could be called a divine life upon earth, a first sketch of supermanhood, of a supramental living in the circumstances of the earth nature. But this could not be the complete and radical change needed, it would not be the total transformation, the fullness of a divine life in a divine body. There would be a body still human and indeed animal in its origin and fundamental character, and this would impose its own inevitable limitations on the higher parts of the embodied being. As limitation by ignorance and error is the fundamental defect of an untransformed mind, as limitation by the imperfect impulses and strainings and wants of desire are the defects of an untransformed life force, so also imperfection of the potentialities of the physical action, an imperfection, a limitation in the response of its half-consciousness to the demands made upon it, and the grossness and stains of its original animality would be the defects of an untransformed or an imperfectly transformed body. These could not but hamper and even pull down towards themselves the action of the higher parts of the nature. A transformation of the body must be the condition for a total transformation of the nature. It might be also that the transformation might take place by stages. There are powers of the nature still belonging to the mental region which are yet potentialities of a growing gnosis lifted beyond our human mentality and partaking of the light and power of the divine, and an ascent through these planes, a descent of them into the mental being might seem to be the natural evolutionary course. But in practice it might be found that these intermediate levels would not be sufficient for the total transformation since, being themselves illumined potentialities of mental being not yet supramental in the full sense of the word, they could bring down to the mind only a partial divinity or raise the mind towards that but not effectuate its elevation into the complete supramentality of the truth consciousness. Still these levels might become stages of the ascent which some would reach and pause there while others went higher and could reach and live on superior strata of a semi-divine existence. It is not to be supposed that all humanity would rise in a block into the supermind. At first those only might attain to the highest or some intermediate height of the ascent whose inner evolution has fitted them for so great a change or who are raised by the direct touch of the divine into its perfect light and power and bliss. The large mass of human beings might still remain for long content with a normal or only a partially illumined and uplifted human nature. But this would be itself a sufficiently radical change and initial transformation of earth life, for the way would be open to all who have the will to rise. The supramental influence of the truth consciousness would touch the earth life and influence even its untransformed mass, and a hope would be there and a promise eventually available to all which now only the few can share in or realize. In any case these would be beginnings only and could not constitute the fullness of the divine life upon earth. It would be a new orientation of the earthly life but not the consummation of its change. For that there must be the sovereign reign of a supramental truth consciousness to which all other forms of life would be subordinated and depend upon it as the master principle and supreme power to which they could look up as the goal, profit by its influences, be moved and upraised by something of its illumination and penetrating force. Especially, as the human body had to come into existence with its modification of the previous animal form and its erect figure of a new power of life and its expressive movements and activities serviceable and necessary to the principle of mind and the life of a mental being, so too a body must be developed with new powers, activities or degrees of a divine action expressive of a truth-conscious being and proper to a supramental consciousness and manifesting a conscious spirit. While the capacity for taking up and sublimating all the activities of the earth life capable of being spiritualized must be there, a transcendence of the original animality and the actions incurably tainted by it, or at least some saving transformation of them, some spiritualizing or psychicizing of the consciousness and motives animating them, and the shedding of whatever could not be so transformed, even a change of what might be called its instrumental structure, its functioning and organization. A complete and hitherto unprecedented control of these things must be the consequence or incidental to this total change. These things have been already to some extent illustrated in the lives of many who have become possessed of spiritual powers but as something exceptional and occasional, the casual or incomplete manifestation of an acquired capacity rather than the organization of a new consciousness, a new life and a new nature. How far can such physical transformation be carried? What are the limits within which it must remain to be consistent with life upon earth and without carrying that life beyond the earthly sphere or pushing it towards the supraterrestrial existence? The supramental consciousness is not a fixed quantity but a power which passes to higher and higher levels of possibility until it reaches supreme consummations of spiritual existence, fulfilling supermind, and supermind fulfills the ranges of spiritual consciousness that are pushing towards it from the human or mental level. In this progression the body also may reach a more perfect form and a higher range of its expressive powers, become a more and more perfect vessel of divinity. This destiny of the body has rarely in the past been envisaged, or else not for the body here upon earth. Such forms would rather be imagined or visioned as the privilege of celestial beings and not possible as the physical residence of a soul still bound to terrestrial nature. The Vaishnavas have spoken of a spiritualized conscious body, Sinmaya Deha. There has been the conception of a radiant or luminous body, which might be the Vedic Jyotirmaya Deha. A light has been seen by some radiating from the bodies of highly developed spiritual persons, even extending to the emission of an enveloping aura, and there has been recorded an initial phenomenon of this kind in the life of so great a spiritual personality as Raman Krishna. But these things have been either conceptual only or rare and occasional, and for the most part the body has not been regarded as possessed of spiritual possibility or capable of transformation. It has been spoken of as the means of effectuation of the Dharma, and Dharma here includes all high purposes, achievements and ideals of life, not excluding the spiritual change, but it is an instrument that must be dropped when its work is done, and though there may be and must be spiritual realization while yet in the body, it can only come to its full fruition after the abandonment of the physical frame. More ordinarily in the spiritual tradition, the body has been regarded as an obstacle, incapable of spiritualization or transmutation, and a heavy weight holding the soul to earthly nature and preventing its ascent either to spiritual fulfillment in the Supreme or to the dissolution of its individual being in the Supreme. But while this conception of the role of the body in our destiny is suitable enough for a sadhana that sees earth only as a field of the ignorance and earth life as a preparation for a saving withdrawal from life, which is the indispensable condition for spiritual liberation, it is insufficient for a sadhana which conceives of a divine life upon earth and liberation of earth nature itself as part of a total purpose of the embodiment of the spirit here. If a total transformation of the being is our aim, a transformation of the body must be an indispensable part of it, without that no full divine life on earth is possible. It is the past evolution of the body and especially its animal nature and animal history which seems to stand in the way of this consummation. The body, as we have seen, is an offspring and creation of the inconscient, itself inconscient or only half-conscious. It began as a form of unconscious matter, developed life, and from a material object became a living growth, developed mind, and from the subconsciousness of the plant and the initial rudimentary mind or incomplete intelligence of the animal developed the intellectual mind and more complete intelligence of man, and now serves as the physical base, container and instrumental means of our total spiritual endeavor. Its animal character and its gross limitations stand indeed as an obstacle to our spiritual perfection, but the fact that it has developed a soul and is capable of serving it as a means may indicate that it is capable of further development and may become a shrine and expression of the spirit, reveal a secret spirituality of matter, become entirely and not only half-conscious, reach a certain oneness with the spirit. This much it must do. So far at least it must transcend its original earth nature, if it is to be the complete instrument of the divine life and no longer an obstacle. Still, the inconveniences of the animal body and its animal nature and impulses and the limitations of the human body at its best are there in the beginning and persist always so long as there is not the full and fundamental liberation and its inconscience or half-conscience and its binding of the soul and mind and life force to matter, to materiality of all kinds, to the call of the unregenerate earth nature are there and constantly oppose the call of the spirit and circumscribe the climb to higher things. To the physical being it brings a bondage to the material instruments, to the brain and heart and senses, wed to materiality and materialism of all kinds, to the bodily mechanism and its needs and obligations, to the imperative need of food and the preoccupation with the means of getting it and storing it as one of the besetting interests of life, to fatigue and sleep, to the satisfaction of bodily desire. The life force in man also is tied down to these small things. It has to limit the scope of its larger ambitions and longings, its drive to rise beyond the pull of earth and follow the heavenlier intuitions of its psychic parts, the heart's ideal and the soul's yearnings. On the mind the body imposes the boundaries of the physical being and the physical life and the sense of the soul complete reality of physical things with the rest as a sort of brilliant fireworks of the imagination, of lights and glories that can only have their full play in heavens beyond, on higher planes of existence, but not here. It afflicts the idea and aspiration with the burden of doubt, the evidence of the subtle senses and the intuition with uncertainty and the vast field of supraphysical consciousness and experience with the imputation of unreality and clamps down to its earthroots the growth of the spirit from its original limiting humanity into the supramental truth and the divine nature. These obstacles can be overcome, the denials and resistance of the body surmounted, its transformation is possible. Even the inconscient and animal part of us can be illumined and made capable of manifesting the God nature, even as our mental humanity can be made to manifest the superhumanity of the supramental truth consciousness and the divinity of what is now superconscious to us, and the total transformation made a reality here. But for this the obligations and compulsions of its animality must cease to be obligatory, and a purification of its materiality effected, by which that very materiality can be turned into a material solidity of the manifestation of the divine nature. For nothing essential must be left out in the totality of the earth change. Matter itself can be turned into a means of revelation of the spiritual reality, the divine. The difficulty is dual, psychological and corporeal. The first is the effect of the unregenerate animality upon the life, especially by the insistence of the body's gross instincts, impulses, desires. The second is the outcome of our corporeal structure and organic instrumentation imposing its restrictions on the dynamism of the higher divine nature. The first of these two difficulties is easier to deal with and conquer, for here the will can intervene and impose on the body the power of the higher nature. Certain of these impulses and instincts of the body have been found especially harmful by the spiritual aspirant and weighed considerably in favor of an ascetic rejection of the body. Sex and sexuality and all that springs from sex and testifies to its existence had to be banned and discarded from the spiritual life, and this, though difficult, is not at all impossible and can be made a cardinal condition for the spiritual seeker. This is natural and unescapable in all ascetic practice, and the satisfaction of this condition, though not easy at first to fulfill, becomes after a time quite feasible. The overcoming of the sex instinct and impulse is indeed binding on all who would attain to self-mastery and lead the spiritual life. A total mastery over it is essential for all spiritual seekers, the eradication of it for the complete ascetic. This much has to be recognized and not diminished in its obligatory importance and its principle. But all recognition of the sex principle, as apart from the gross physical indulgence of the sex impulse, could not be excluded from a divine life upon earth. It is there in life, plays a large part and has to be dealt with. It cannot simply be ignored, merely suppressed or held down or put away out of sight. In the first place, it is in one of its aspects a cosmic and even a divine principle. It takes the spiritual form of the Ishvara and the Shakti, and without it there could be no world creation or manifestation of the world principle of Purusha and Prakriti, which are both necessary for the creation, necessary too in their association and interchange for the play of its psychological working, and in their manifestation as soul and nature fundamental to the whole process of the Lila. In the divine life itself an incarnation, or at least in some form a presence of the two powers or their initiating influence through their embodiments or representatives, would be indispensable for making the new creation possible. In its human action on the mental and vital level, sex is not altogether an undivine principle. It has its nobler aspects and idealities, and it has to be seen in what way and to what extent these can be admitted into the new and larger life. All gross animal indulgence of sex desire and impulse would have to be eliminated. It could only continue among those who are not ready for the higher life or not yet ready for a complete spiritual living. In all who aspired to it but could not yet take it up in its fullness, sex will have to be refined, submit to the spiritual or psychic impulse, and are controlled by the higher mind and the higher vital, and shed all its lighter, frivolous or degraded forms and feel the touch of the purity of the ideal. Love would remain, all forms of the pure truth of love in higher and higher steps till it realized its highest nature, widened into universal love, merged into the love of the divine. The love of man and woman would also undergo that elevation and consummation, for all that can feel a touch of the ideal and the spiritual must follow the way of ascent till it reaches the divine reality. The body and its activities must be accepted as part of the divine life and pass under this law. But, as in the other evolutionary transitions, what cannot accept the law of the divine life cannot be accepted and must fall away from the ascending nature. Another difficulty that the transformation of the body has to face is its dependence for its very existence upon food, and here too are involved the gross physical instincts, impulses, desires that are associated with this difficult factor, the essential cravings of the palate, the greed of food and animal gluttony of the belly, the coarsening of the mind when it grovels in the mud of sense, obeys a servitude to its mere animal part and hugs its bondage to matter. The higher human in us seeks refuge in a temperate moderation, in abstemiousness and abstinence, or in carelessness about the body and its wants, and in an absorption in higher things. The spiritual seeker often, like the Jain ascetics, seeks refuge in long and frequent fasts which lift him temporarily at least out of the clutch of the body's demands and help him to feel in himself a pure vacancy of the wide rooms of the spirit. But all this is not liberation, and the question may be raised whether, not only at first but always, the divine life also must submit to this necessity. But it could only deliver itself from it altogether if it could find out the way so to draw upon the universal energy that the energy would sustain not only the vital parts of our physicality but its constituent matter with no need of aid for sustenance from any outside substance of matter. It is indeed possible even while fasting for very long periods to maintain the full energies and activities of the soul and mind and life, even those of the body, to remain wakeful but concentrated in yoga all the time, or to think deeply and write day and night, to dispense with sleep, to walk 8 hours a day, maintaining all these activities separately or together and not feel any loss of strength, any fatigue, any kind of failure or decadence. At the end of the fast one can even resume at once taking the normal or even a greater than the normal amount of nourishment without any transition or precaution such as medical science enjoins, as if both the complete fasting and the feasting were natural conditions, alternating by an immediate and easy passage from one to the other, of a body already trained by a sort of initial transformation to be an instrument of the powers and activities of yoga. But one thing one does not escape, and that is the wasting of the material tissues of the body, its flesh and substance. Conceivably, if a practicable way and means could only be found, this last invincible obstacle too might be overcome and the body maintained by an interchange of its forces with the forces of material nature, giving to her need from the individual and taking from her directly the sustaining energies of her universal existence. Conceivably, one might rediscover and re-establish at the summit of the evolution of life the phenomenon we see at its base, the power to draw from all around it the means of sustenance and self-renewal. Or else the evolved being might acquire the greater power to draw down those means from above rather than draw them up or pull them in from the environment around, all about it and below it. But until something like this is achieved or made possible, we have to go back to food and the established material forces of nature. In fact, we do, however unconsciously, draw constantly upon the universal energy, the force in matter to replenish our material existence and the mental, vital and other potencies in the body. We do it directly in the invisible processes of interchange constantly kept up by nature and by special means devised by her. Breathing is one of these, sleep also, and repose. But as her basic means for maintaining and renewing the gross physical body and its workings and inner potencies, nature has selected the taking in of outside matter in the shape of food, its digestion, assimilation of what is assimilable and elimination of what cannot or ought not to be assimilated. This by itself is sufficient for mere maintenance, but for assuring health and strength in the body so maintained it has added the impulse towards physical exercise and play of many kinds, ways for the expenditure and renewal of energy, the choice or the necessity of manifold action and labor. In the new life, in its beginnings at least, it would not be necessary or advisable to make any call for an extreme or precipitate rejection of the need of food or the established natural method for the maintenance of the still imperfectly transformed body. If or when these things have to be transcended, it must come as a result of the awakened will of the spirit, a will also in matter itself, an imperative evolutionary urge, an act of the creative transmutations of time or a descent from the transcendence. Meanwhile, the drawing in of the universal energy by a conscious action of the higher powers of the being from around or from above, by a call to what is still to us a transcending consciousness, or by an invasion or descent from the transcendence itself, may well become an occasional, a frequent or a constant phenomenon, and even reduce the part played by food and its need to an incidence no longer preoccupying, a necessity minor and less imperative. Meanwhile, food and the ordinary process of nature can be accepted, although its use has to be liberated from attachment and desire and the grosser undiscriminating appetites and clutch at the pleasures of the flesh, which is the way of the ignorance. The physical processes have to be subtilized and the grossest may have to be eliminated and new processes found or new instrumentalities emerge. So long as it is accepted, a refined pleasure in it may be permitted, and even a desireless ananda of taste take the place of the physical relish and the human selection by likings and dislikings, which is our present imperfect response to what is offered to us by nature. It must be remembered that for the divine life on earth and matter have not to be and cannot be rejected but have only to be sublimated and to reveal in themselves the possibilities of the spirit, serve the spirit's highest uses and be transformed into instruments of a greater living. The divine life must always be actuated by the push towards perfection. A perfection of the joy of life is part and an essential part of it. The body's delight in things and the body's joy of life are not excluded from it. They too have to be made perfect. A large totality is the very nature of this new and growing way of existence, a fullness of the possibilities of the mind transmuted into a thing of light, of the life converted into a force of spiritual power and joy, of the body transformed into an instrument of a divine action, divine knowledge, divine bliss. All can be taken into its scope that is capable of transforming itself, all that can be an instrument, a vessel, an opportunity for the expression of this totality of the self-manifesting spirit. There is one problem raised by sects for those who would reject in toto the obligations imposed by the animality of the body and put forward by it as an insistent opposition in the way of the aspirant to a higher life. It is the necessity of the prolongation of the race for which the sex activity is the only means already provided by nature for living beings and inevitably imposed upon the race. It is not indeed necessary for the individual seeker after a divine life to take up this problem or even for a group who do not seek after it for themselves alone but desire a wide acceptance of it by mankind as at least an ideal. There will always be the multitude who do not concern themselves with it or are not ready for its complete practice, and to these can be left the care for the prolongation of the race. The number of those who lead the divine life can be maintained and increased as the ideal extends itself, by the voluntary adhesion of those who are touched by the aspiration, and there need be no resort to physical means for this purpose, no deviation from the rule of a strict sexual abstinence. But yet there may be circumstances in which, from another standpoint, a voluntary creation of bodies for souls that seek to enter the earth life to help in the creation and extension of the divine life upon earth might be found to be desirable. Then the necessity of a physical procreation for this purpose could only be avoided if new means of a supraphysical kind were evolved and made available. A development of this kind must necessarily belong to what is now considered as the sphere of the occult and the use of concealed powers of action or creation not known or possessed by the common mind of the race. Occultism means rightly the use of the higher powers of our nature, soul, mind, life force and the faculties of the subtle physical consciousness to bring about results on their own or on the material plane by some pressure of their own secret law and its potentialities, for manifestation and result in human or earthly mind and life and body or in objects and events in the world of matter. A discovery or an extension of these little known or yet undeveloped powers is now envisaged by some well-known thinkers as a next step to be taken by mankind in its immediate evolution. The kind of creation spoken of has not been included among these developments, but it could well be considered as one of the new possibilities. Even physical science is trying to find physical means for passing beyond the ordinary instrumentation or procedure of nature in this matter of propagation or the renewal of the physical life force in human or animal beings, but the resort to occult means and the intervention of subtle physical processes, if it could be made possible, would be a greater way which could avoid the limitations, degradations, incompleteness and heavy imperfection of the means and results solely available to the law of material force. In India there has been always from the earliest times a widely spread belief in the possibility and reality of the use of these powers by men with an advanced knowledge of these secret things or with a developed spiritual knowledge and experience and dynamic force, and even, in the tantras, an organized system of their method and practice. The intervention of the yogi in bringing about a desired birth of offspring is also generally believed in and often appealed to, and the bestowal on the child so obtained of a spiritual attainment or destiny by his will or his blessing is sometimes asked for, and such a result is recorded not only in the tradition of the past but maintained by the witness of the present. But there is here still the necessity of a resort to the normal means of propagation and the gross method of physical nature. A purely occult method, a resort to supraphysical processes acting by supraphysical means for a physical result would have to be possible if we are to avoid this necessity. The resort to the sex impulse and its animal process could not be transcended otherwise. If there is some reality in the phenomenon of materialization and dematerialization claimed to be possible by occultists and evidenced by occurrences many of us have witnessed, a method of this kind would not be out of the range of possibility. For in the theory of the occultists and in the gradation of the ranges and planes of our being which yoga knowledge outlines for us, there is not only a subtle physical force but a subtle physical matter intervening between life and gross matter, and to create in this subtle physical substance and precipitate the forms thus made into our grosser materiality is feasible. It should be possible, and it is believed to be possible, for an object formed in this subtle physical substance to make a transit from its subtlety into the state of gross matter directly by the intervention of an occult force and process, whether with or even without the assistance or intervention of some gross material procedure. A soul wishing to enter into a body or form for itself a body and take part in a divine life upon earth might be assisted to do so, or even provided with such a form by this method of direct transmutation without passing through birth by the sex process or undergoing any degradation or any of the heavy limitations in the growth and development of its mind and material body inevitable to our present way of existence. It might then assume at once the structure and greater powers and functionings of the truly divine material body, which must one day emerge in a progressive evolution to a totally transformed existence, both of the life and form in a divinized earth nature. But what would be the internal or external form and structure, and what the instrumentation of this divine body? The material history of the development of the animal and human body has left it bound to a minutely constructed and elaborated system of organs and a precarious order of their functioning, which can easily become a disorder, open to a general or local disorganization, dependent on an easily disturbed nervous system and commanded by a brain whose vibrations are supposed to be mechanical and automatic and not under our conscious control. According to the materialist, all this is a functioning of matter alone, whose fundamental reality is chemical. We have to suppose that the body is constructed by the agency of chemical elements building up atoms and molecules and cells, and these again are the agents and only conductors at the basis of a complicated physical structure and instrumentation, which is the sole mechanical cause of all our actions, thoughts, feelings. The soul of fiction and mind and life only a material and mechanical manifestation and appearance of this machine, which is worked out and automatically driven with a figment of consciousness in it by the forces inherent in inconscient matter. If that were the truth, it is obvious that any divinization or divine transformation of the body or of anything else would be nothing but an illusion, an imagination, a senseless and impossible chimera. But even if we suppose a soul, a conscious will at work in this body, it could not arrive at a divine transformation if there were no radical change in the bodily instrument itself and in the organization of its material workings. The transforming agent will be bound and stopped in its work by the physical organism's unalterable limitations and held up by the unmodified or imperfectly modified original animal in us. The possibility of the disorders, derangements, maladies native to these physical arrangements would still be there and could only be shut out by a constant vigilance or perpetual control obligatory on the corporeal instrument's spiritual inhabitant and master. This could not be called a truly divine body, for in a divine body an inherent freedom from all these things would be natural and perpetual. This freedom would be a normal and native truth of its being, and therefore inevitable and unalterable. A radical transformation of the functioning and, it may well be, of the structure and certainly of the two mechanical and material impulse and driving forces of the bodily system would be imperative. What agency could we find which we could make the means of this all-important liberation and change? Something there is in us, or something has to be developed, perhaps a central and still occult part of our being containing forces whose powers in our actual and present make-up are only a fraction of what could be, but if they became complete and dominant would be truly able to bring about, with the help of the light and force of the soul and the supramental truth consciousness, the necessary physical transformation and its consequences. This might be found in the system of chakras revealed by tantric knowledge and accepted in the systems of yoga, conscious centers and sources of all the dynamic powers of our being organizing their action through the plexuses and arranged in an ascending series from the lowest physical to the highest mind center and spiritual center, called the thousand-petaled lotus, where ascending nature, the serpent power of the tantrics, meets the Brahmin and is liberated into the divine being. These centers are closed or half-closed within us and have to be opened before their full potentiality can be manifested in our physical nature. But once they are opened and completely active, no limit can easily be set to the development of their potencies and the total transformation to be possible. But what would be the result of the emergence of these forces and their liberated and diviner action on the body itself? What their dynamic connection with it and their transforming operation on the still existing animal nature and its animal impulses and gross material procedure? It might be held that the first necessary change would be the liberation of the mind, the life force, the subtle physical agencies and the physical consciousness into a freer and a diviner activity, a many-dimensioned and unlimited operation of their consciousness, a large outbreak of higher powers and the sublimation of the bodily consciousness itself, of its instrumentation, capability for the manifestation of the soul in the world of matter. The subtle senses now concealed in us might come forward into a free action and the material senses themselves become means or channels for the vision of what is now invisible to us or the discovery of things surrounding us but at present unseizable and held back from our knowledge. A firm check might be put on the impulses of the animal nature or they might be purified and subtilized so as to become assets and not liabilities and so transformed as to be parts and processes of a diviner life. But even these changes would still leave a residue of material processes keeping the old way and not amenable to the higher control and, if this could not be changed, the rest of the transformation might itself be checked and incomplete. A total transformation of the body would demand a sufficient change of the most material part of the organism, its constitution, its processes and its setup of nature. Again, it might be thought that a full control would be sufficient, a knowledge and a vision of this organism and its unseen action and an effective control determining its operations according to the conscious will. This possibility has been affirmed as something already achieved and a part of the development of the inner powers in some. The cessation of the breathing while still the life of the body remains stable, the hermetic sealing up at will not only of the breath but of all the vital manifestations for long periods, the stoppage of the heart similarly at will while thought and speech and other mental workings continued unabated. These and other phenomena of the power of the will over the body are known and well-attested examples of this kind of mastery. But these are occasional or sporadic successes and do not amount to transformation. A total control is necessary and an established and customary and, indeed, a natural mastery. Even with that achieved, something more fundamental might have to be demanded for the complete liberation and change into a divine body. Again, it might be urged that the organic structure of the body no less than its basic outer form would have to be retained as a necessary material foundation for the retention of the earth nature, the connection of the divine life with the life of earth and a continuance of the evolutionary process so as to prevent a breaking upward out of and away from it into a state of being which would properly belong to a higher plane and not to a terrestrial divine fulfillment. The prolonged existence of the animal itself in our nature, if sufficiently transformed to be an instrument of manifestation and not an obstacle, would be necessary to preserve the continuity, the evolutionary total. It would be needed as the living vehicle, Varna, of the emergent God in the material world where he would have to act and achieve the works and wonders of the new life. It is certain that a form of body making this connection and a bodily action containing the earth dynamism and its fundamental activities must be there, but the connection should not be a bond or a confining limitation or a contradiction of the totality of the change. The maintenance of the present organism without any transformation of it would not but act as such a bond and confinement within the old nature. There would be a material base, but it would be of the earthy, an old and not a new earth with a diviner psychological structure, for with that structure the old system would be out of harmony and it would be unable to serve its further evolution or even to uphold it as a base in matter. It would bind part of the being, a lower part to an untransformed humanity and unchanged animal functioning and prevent its liberation into the superhumanity of the supramental nature. A change is then necessary here too, a necessary part of the total bodily transformation, which would divinize the whole man, at least in the ultimate result and not leave his evolution incomplete. This aim, it must be said, would be sufficiently served if the instrumentation of the centers and their forces reigned over all the activities of the nature with an entire domination of the body and made it both in its structural form and its organic workings a free channel and means of communication and a plastic instrument of cognition and dynamic action for all that they had to do in the material life, in the world of matter. There would have to be a change in the operative processes of the material organs themselves and, it may well be, in their very constitution and their importance, they could not be allowed to impose their limitations imperatively on the new physical life. To begin with, they might become more clearly outer ends of the channels of communication and action, more serviceable for the psychological purposes of the inhabitant, less blindly material in their responses, more conscious of the act and aim of the inner movements and powers which use them and which they are wrongly supposed by the material man in us to generate and to use. The brain would be a channel of communication of the form of the thoughts and a battery of their insistence on the body and the outside world where they could then become effective directly, communicating themselves without physical means from mind to mind, producing with a similar directness effects on the thoughts, actions and lives of others or even upon material things. The heart would equally be a direct communicant and medium of interchange for the feelings and emotions thrown outward upon the world by the forces of the psychic center. Heart could reply directly to heart, the life force come to the help of other lives and answer their call in spite of strangeness and distance. Many beings without any external communication thrill with the message and meet in the secret light from one divine center. The will might control the organs that deal with food, safeguard automatically the health, eliminate greed and desire, substitute subtler processes or draw in strength and substance from the universal life force so that the body could maintain for a long time its own strength and substance without loss or waste, remaining thus with no need of sustenance by material elements, and yet continuous strenuous action with no fatigue or pause for sleep or repose. The soul's will or the minds could act from higher sources upon the sex center and the sex organs so as to check firmly or even banish the grosser sexual impulse or stimulus, and instead of serving an animal excitation or crude drive or desire turn their use to the storing, production and direction towards brain and heart and life force of the essential energy, Ghose, of which this region is the factory so as to support the works of the mind and soul and spirit and the higher life powers and limit the expenditure of the energy on lower things. The soul, the psychic being, could more easily fill all with the light and turn the very matter of the body to higher uses for its own greater purpose. This would be a first potent change, but not by any means all that is possible or desirable. For it may well be that the evolutionary urge would proceed to a change of the organs themselves in their material working and use and diminish greatly the need of their instrumentation and even of their existence. The centers in the subtle body, skma, of which one would become conscious and aware of all going on in it, would pour their energies into material nerve and plexus and tissue and radiate them through the whole material body. All the physical life and its necessary activities in this new existence could be maintained and operated by these higher agencies in a freer and ampler way and by a less burdensome and restricting method. This might go so far that these organs might cease to be indispensable and even be felt as too obstructive. The central force might use them less and finally throw aside their use altogether. If that happened, they might waste by atrophy, be reduced to an insignificant minimum or even disappear. The central force might substitute for them subtle organs of a very different character or, if anything material was needed, instruments that would be forms of dynamism or plastic transmitters rather than what we know as organs. This might well be part of a supreme total transformation of the body, though this too might not be final. To envisage such changes is to look far ahead, and minds attached to the present form of things may be unable to give credence to their possibility. No such limits and no such impossibility of any necessary change can be imposed on the evolutionary urge. All has not to be fundamentally changed, on the contrary, all has to be preserved that is still needed in the totality, but all has to be perfected. Whatever is necessary for the evolutionary purpose for the increasing, enlarging, heightening of the consciousness, which seems to be its central will and aim here, or the progression of its enabling means and preserving environment has to be kept and furthered, but what has to be overpassed, whatever has no longer a use or is degraded, what has become unhelpful or retarding, can be discarded and dropped on the way. That has been evident in the history of the evolution of the body from its beginning in elementary forms to its most developed type, the human. There is no reason why this process should not intervene in the transition from the human into the divine body. For the manifestation or building of a divine body on earth, there must be an initial transformation, the appearance of a new, a greater and more developed type, not a continuance with little modifications of the present physical form and its limited possibilities. What has to be preserved must indeed be preserved, and that means whatever is necessary or thoroughly serviceable for the uses of the new life on earth, whatever is still needed and will serve its purpose but imperfect, will have to be retained but developed and perfected. Whatever is no longer of use for new aims or is a disability must be thrown aside. The necessary forms and instrumentations of matter must remain, since it is in a world of matter that the divine life has to manifest, but their materiality must be refined, uplifted, ennobled, illumined, since matter and the world of matter have increasingly to manifest the indwelling spirit. The new type, the divine body, must continue the already developed evolutionary form. There must be a continuation from the type nature has all along been developing, a continuity from the human to the divine body, no breaking away to something unrecognizable but a high sequel to what has already been achieved and in part perfected. The human body has in it parts and instruments that have been sufficiently evolved to serve the divine life. These have to survive in their form, though they must be still further perfected, their limitations of range and use removed, their liability to defect and malady and impairment eliminated, their capacities of cognition and dynamic action carried beyond the present limits. New powers have to be acquired by the body which our present humanity could not hope to realize, could not even dream of, or could only imagine. Much that can now only be known, worked out or created by the use of invented tools and machinery might be achieved by the new body in its own power or by the inhabitant spirit through its own direct spiritual force. The body itself might acquire new means and ranges of communication with other bodies, new processes of acquiring knowledge, a new aesthesis, new potencies of manipulation of itself and objects. It might not be impossible for it to possess or disclose means native to its own constitution, substance or natural instrumentation for making the far near and annulling distance, cognizing what is now beyond the body's cognizance, acting where action is now out of its reach or its domain, developing subtleties and plasticities which could not be permitted under present conditions to the needed fixity of a material frame. These and other numerous potentialities might appear and the body become an instrument immeasurably superior to what we can now imagine as possible. There could be an evolution from a first apprehending truth consciousness to the utmost heights of the ascending ranges of supermind, and it may pass the borders of the supermind proper itself, where it begins to shadow out, develop, delineate expressive forms of life touched by a supreme pure existence, consciousness and bliss which constitute the worlds of a highest truth of existence, dynamism of tapas, glory and sweetness of bliss, the absolute essence and pitch of the all-creating Ananda. The transformation of the physical being might follow this incessant line of progression, and the divine body reflect or reproduce here in a divine life on the earth something of this highest greatness and glory of the self-manifesting spirit.